Hello and welcome to our xtUML learning series. In this first episode we're going to introduce the context of xtUML and look at model-driven development and the role it plays in systems engineering. We'll also talk about xtUML and how it can play as a part of delivering a model-driven development solution in this context, and how xtUML is available to you through xtUML.org. xtUML.org is supporting this series of seminars to help people understand executable and translatable UML, which is what xtUML means, and link you to people who know more about this and are able to extend its use. xtUML.org we will talk about later on in this episode and explain to you how you can join and participate. I'm very pleased to introduce this learning series about xtUML. My name's Bill Chown and I'm going to talk to you in this first two sessions about the environment in which xtUML plays, how xtUML is different from other modeling languages you might be familiar with, and how we can apply the xtUML process. As we go on through the series, so we will go into detail about the structure of xtUML, how to use it for modeling, and how to take advantage of the executable and translatable features. We'll also go into some depth as to more advanced topics for people who wish to extend and really deploy xtUML as part of their processes. This is a series of 15 seminars which will be initially offered weekly and will also be available after the event recorded so that you can look at them at your leisure. Today in this first pass we're going to look at the systems engineering context, the problem space that people work in as systems get more and more complex, and how model-driven solutions, the broader scope of model-driven engineering, can be applied to help in this area. We'll also initially look at the application of executable translatable UML to providing a model-driven engineering solution to the systems engineering needs. Systems designs are more and more complex. The requirements that have to be met, the different disciplines that have to be applied, and the challenges of getting not only a design that will work, but a design that will work well, a successful implementation optimized to serve the needs of standards, performance, and costs. We're going to focus on embedded systems, systems that are designed for a particular application, that combine hardware, software, mechanical, physical aspects to produce a domain-specific targeted solution for a particular purpose. Sometimes these are individual entities, such as are depicted here. Sometimes they're a system of systems working together across networks. Whatever, they typically are very interactive, have many different aspects that it takes to create and implement these systems, and are very complex to put together. Historically, we've been used to assembling systems themselves, building physical prototypes to validate them, and that method has worked, but it's becoming more and more challenging to achieve that kind of validation. And if you do get to the point of building a physical prototype, it's usually far too late to be able to go back, make significant changes, and satisfy needs. And as we move more and more into rigorous certification rules, we find it necessary to be able to prove that we did indeed, through the design processes, evaluate and understand what was going on, and confirm that we made tests and checks such that we expect the final product to meet standards and to perform as expected and safely for the audience that it's intended for. To put together a system like that is really a multidisciplinary, multi-domain, multi-role task. Systems engineering says that we take a look at the problem from a holistic point of view. What that amounts to is that somebody, we'll call them architects or systems engineers, are looking initially at all of the factors that need to be taken into account to put together a system. They need flexibility, they need the opportunity to try out alternatives, to trade off. And traditionally a lot of that work has been done with ad hoc tools and solutions. But we'll propose in this series how that can be more effectively be done by applying techniques that are represented by executable and translatable modeling. Translatable means that the ideas that come from an architect can be conveyed downstream to the builders, the component designers, be it hardware or software, mechanical, physical, whatever it might be. They work in a specific discipline, and the factors that dictate the required outputs of that discipline become the focus of the work they're on. The domain is very narrow and typically works in its own way with its own kind of information, flows, data, and expertise, in order to create the individual parts that have to be put together to complete the system. So we need somebody who's going to do that completion work, a system integrator, who's going to put together the individual components of the big system, connect them up, make them operate correctly. So each of these different roles or disciplines has different needs. Our architect or systems engineer starts out with requirements. If we can provide solutions enabling requirements modeling, then it becomes practical to start in an environment, look at choices, trade-offs, try out alternatives, and see what's going on. And in the course of this session, we'll look at active requirements validation by building an executable specification and understanding how that can be applied to enabling those choices to be made. The component designer has a very specific set of needs, and in executing his design, he needs to be able to take account of the factors of that particular discipline, look at the design, validate that it does indeed do what it should do and it has been created correctly, and debug any problems. And he needs an efficient implementation pathway to producing the output, hardware, software, whatever it might be, that has to be generated at this stage, that's going to go on to be the product that the system integrator will combine to put the system together. By the time we get to system integration, the system is supposed to perform as it should in its final incarnation. We care about performance factors such as real-world timing, as well as the functional behavior and the way in which the building blocks interact. And so we need some kind of virtual way of enabling the system integrator to put together the platform at an early stage in the process. Look at the way in which the component parts, in my example here, hardware and software, are going to interact, and be able to make recommendations for any necessary changes in order to reach the final system that we want. And a virtual platform environment here can be a very effective tool in building up that space. Within each of these roles, there are some key system design questions that need to be asked. The first one of those is validating, am I meeting requirements? Am I building the right thing? What was it that the requirement writer was expecting? We also want to be able to build something that is going to meet the specifications to best effect. We don't want just the first version we can assemble. It would be good to be able to optimize for design goals and performance, make some trade-offs, and get the best possible functional architecture and system level design. This will then be passed on to those who are actually going to build it, implement it, and we care about making sure that there are no functional errors in any kinds of parts of the design. We may well want to reuse a functional block that was previously validated in some other system and apply it to this one, but we have to ensure that it is configured and integrated properly so that it does its job in the context of the new environment. And here we're now focused more and more upon the implementation and want to be able to verify at the implementation level whether or not we've achieved the design goals and built what should be built, and built it to the best possible effect. And throughout these, we need to be cognizant of the costs involved. And cost isn't just money, but that's a key factor. The whole life cycle of a product, from its concept all the way through to its final use in its application area, needs to be considered. Frequently nowadays, no one company is putting a system together all on their own, but they are bringing in parts of that system through a supply chain, and the interactions in that supply chain have a very material impact upon the overall system costs. And of course, throughout the life of development, if something has to change, and it always does, then the cost of change and the impact of that change needs to be factored in. And if these thoughts can be with the team right from the very beginning, the opportunity to affect these costs is much more real at the beginning of the project. So in a system design space, we're looking for methodologies that will help, and model-driven development is one that has proven in many projects to be an effective path forward in addressing complex systems. Now, there are many terms you will see used with the model term. I'm going to look at an overall scope, and I'm going to call that model-driven engineering, all the different aspects of what's going on in putting together some solution. You will see many uses of model-driven or model-based as a term, model-based systems engineering, model-based design, and so on. And these often apply to particular aspects of a design discipline. But what I'd like to focus on today is model-driven development. And development is key here. We're trying to develop an end result. We're trying to use the models that we have in the design process to drive that end result. So the key to an effective model-driven development environment is that the model is indeed the design that we're trying to achieve. It will grow and evolve through the course and the life cycle of the product development process, but there is a flow from abstraction level to abstraction level. We start typically at a high level of abstraction. What high abstraction means is a reduction of detail to the point where we are able to ask useful questions and make decisions about the design without being encumbered by every final point about it. But later on, we need to bring in more and more detail because there are other questions that cannot be answered without adding that information. And we want to be able to go through that sequence of evolution and directly drive all the way down the implementation process. So the implementation needs to be directly derived from the model we start with. So what is a model? A model is a representation of the design we're going to develop and the way in which it's going to behave, the features it's going to have. When we start out with an idea, then we don't necessarily have a model of what it's going to be. We don't necessarily, in fact, have detailed requirements as to what we need. It's just a conceptual proposal. Wouldn't it be good if we could create one of these? An effective way to represent what it is we think we're going to create is some form of model. And this model could range from the proverbial back of a napkin all the way through to very elaborate, very well constructed physical, electrical, software, hardware models of all sorts of forms. A concept model enables us to share ideas with people, to show what it is we're thinking about, to explore the design space and look at the problem, to consider what the requirements might really be, to come up with some alternative solution models, and use those to exchange ideas with the originators of the request and the potential marketplace. If we've got some form of model, a representation, then we're able to use that model to show people what was it we were talking about, what did we suggest. From those models we can ask questions and we can make choices and maybe select from a set of potential solutions to see what we're going to do. Having identified some potential ideas, then we can continue to look at what they can do for us, looking, for example, at performance, and from that deriving new requirements that help to specify what it is that we really are going to make. So the goal of this concept modeling process is to be able to consider the requirements, come up with proposals as to how to address those requirements, and from that derive some development-oriented derived requirements. So we are able then to use those derived requirements to drive the next step in the process. The derived requirements need to be actionable. In other words, we need to be able to work with them and do something from them. They need to be concrete, explicit enough that we can use them to proceed on down the process. And ideally, they need to be executable so that we can try out the problem, exercise it, put it through its paces, and see what it does. And then we want it to be implementable. And of course, we'd like to be able to trace back and be quite sure that at any stage through the design process, we understand how close we are to the original objectives, how those objectives evolved, and what it is we need to do to keep track of all the work we're doing in the design project. So moving on from a concept model and those high-level solutions, we're developing requirements throughout the flow, and those requirements will live with the project the whole way through its life. What also needs to live with the project through its life is the ability to show off what's happening, to demonstrate progress as it is being made, to demonstrate the behaviors and characteristics of the product so that people can react to those characteristics, can share thoughts, can update the requirements. And this demonstration is something I really want to focus upon, because all too often in model-driven development processes, I've seen circumstances where a project is working well, but has failed to convince other people not used to the methodology that progress is indeed being made. A demonstration, an executable model, enables that progress to be shown off, enables features to be exhibited, enables opinions to be formed. It also enables us to extract a system model, elaborating from those possible solutions the ones that look like the most probable candidates, meet the performance goals, serve the needs we're going to have to work forward with. From a system model, we'll start to look at architecture, breaking down the problem into implementable pieces, determining how those implementable pieces will be shared amongst design teams that will address the different disciplines necessary to put together a real system. And those complex different disciplines all need to interact with each other, to recognize the requirements that are relevant to their particular piece, and to demonstrate how their pieces play with the other pieces in the system and how their pieces meet the needs of those requirements. And if you don't keep up with that demonstration, here again is an opportunity for subsystems to get out of track with each other, for communications to start breaking down. And executable models at all these stages can be very effective at helping to understand the interdependencies between these independent blocks. Eventually we come to something that is the implementation model, and there's probably one of these within each of these different subsystems. It's still a model, it's still what we're going to implement. It's not what we already have implemented. It's a model at the end of this sequence of modeling that has enabled us to look at the problems, look at the needs, understand the requirements, and only when we've got a really good understanding of what it is we need to make, to go and make that, to hopefully make it right the first time, but at least to make something that's very close to the target that we need to get to. And from that target, we can then determine how well we've met the requirements and how completely we've satisfied the overall process needs. Now, of course, throughout the flow, we need to be looking at how these pieces are going to tie together, how well they meet their needs. So be able to perform validation of the behavior of our model against the requirements we started with. To be able to set up an environment for verification so that we can show that we did indeed test all the attributes and all the characteristics. We did indeed look for the bad characteristics, for things that could go wrong, and understand how the system's really going to work. It takes an integrated team of different disciplines to do this process effectively, to come up with the right set of solution models in the first place, to select from them which one is going to be the one that we're going to start working on and the path we're going to go forward, or maybe several models that are viable alternatives at the early stages of a design process, giving the opportunity to try out design ideas and see where it goes. As we evolve into those subsystems, the expertise of the teams gets applied to the implementation, and domain-specific skills come into play as implementation and targets are created. Those domain expertises will typically find there are caveats, challenges, preferences that need to be addressed, and will generate feedback into the system. And if we have continuity in the model chain, traceability back to where did this implementation originate, then it becomes possible to be very effective and efficient in providing iterations in the design process. Because we're working at a level of models, even if they're very elaborate models, the investment that's been made is still nothing like as much as having built physical implementations, built physical prototypes in order to be able to move on to that validation, and therefore the opportunity to iterate can be far more effective. So let's have a look at what we mean by demonstrate. Demonstrate with an executable specification. We want to create a demonstration of the requirements right at the very beginning of the process in some active form that can be assessed and adjusted. So we build a model that can execute, that can go through its paces, that can show off what it does, even if at a very abstract level. And then we want to be able to ask questions. What is going on in this step? Why did you do it that way? How did you come up with that particular set of measurements you need to make? All those kind of questions will come up throughout the design process, but the more of them that can be brought up at the very beginning can be applied to an executable model, can be tried out, can be assessed, the better opportunity there is to be able to go through the process and build the most effective solution. From those questions, learning comes. We can evolve the model, derive better requirements, and go on to drive from our executable specification into a design process. And by having an executable specification, it's something that can be referred back to later on in the design flow. We can go back to the executable specification and execute it again. In other words, run the models and see what the model did, and compare that with perhaps an implementation choice that comes up later in the flow. So this can be reused during implementation as a checkpoint, as a reference, as a guide to what was intended through the design process. This becomes extremely effective when there's a supply chain involved and the originator of the specification is working in a different geography, a different language, a different environment from the implementer of the subsystem that's being specified. Having an executable specification is a very, very effective way of showing what was meant by the requirements. Of course, we're not making a system in one piece. From that concept and the executable specification at the beginning, we're going to partition the problem, and executable specifications that can be shared with the individual disciplines, showing what the system needs to do rather than trying to specify how they implement it, enables those teams to go away and produce their chosen implementations, work on their partition of the problem, and come back with an instance of what they believe to be satisfies those requirements. If we can then provide an environment where we can apply some tests, in other words, ask key questions in the design process, and see whether or not our system does the job, we can learn more about what's going on. And during the course of this seminar series, we will talk about virtual platforms and how you can apply a virtual platform as a method of exercising that design as it grows, enabling it to run through and do its paces, again at a modeling level, and apply model-driven development to each step through the process as the model evolves, so it becomes more specialized. As it evolves and becomes specialized, we can ask questions. When we learn from those questions, we can update the model, make changes, iterate the design process, produce a more effective design. By using a virtual platform, design teams are able to do this earlier in the process and able to take advantage of the learning they have, so that when they go forward into implementation, the product that gets generated actually meets the needs and performs the goals set out. So what we've been doing here is walking down from high levels of abstraction, in other words, lesser amounts of detail, to more and more detail that enables us to ask more detailed questions. At the high level of abstraction, we call a platform-independent model the vehicle we're going to use to look at the functions, understand the architecture, specify the interfaces between functional blocks, and look at those interactions. By having a model that we can execute, we can demonstrate that the requirements are understood, that we know what was meant by a requirement, that we can iterate that requirement until it is understood, and that we can use that to go forward. By specifying interfaces at a platform-independent level, as we move on through the design process, the requirements of each different discipline to serve up their components are set out in contract form in those interfaces, and they form a basis of being able to put together a complete system later on. So from a platform-independent model, we will start to take account of the characteristics of the environment that we're going to move on into. Platform-dependent models become discipline-specific, take account of a particular type of computer architecture that's going to be used to execute software, the constraints of certain hardware types, the ability of data transfer systems to transfer data at a certain rate. And that information starts to color the models. So platform-dependent models are still models. They're not the implementation, but they take account of implementation details, and they enable us to start asking questions. And this is where a virtual platform lets us put together hardware and software in the forms that they are now developed to run them and test them, and to take account of contention on a physical data transfer bus, to take account of performance capabilities of a system, to ask questions about what kind of resources the system has to have in order for it to deliver the functions and behavior needed in an implementable fashion. And from that, we will continue to specialize, and platform-specific models are implementation-driven. They're focused upon the particular areas. Hardware design might use a hardware description language for a platform-specific model, whereas earlier on we were using more abstract and flexible languages that enabled us to make choices, to trade off different solutions. Platform-specific models will enable us to run much more detailed verifications and tests, and become the basis of the deliverables that are going to be supplied out of the process. So these terms, platform-independent model, platform-dependent models, and platform-specific models, will often be seen in discussions of model-driven development processes. We want these models to drive down through those flows and those layers. Models can and absolutely should drive the implementation process. Historically in software, UML models have been used to generate code, and that process has been refined to the point where completely automatically ready-to-run code can be created for a particular processor architecture, operating system, or whatever constraints it might need to meet. It can also be set up such that the generation process enforces standards, coding standards or certification standards, so that this can be safety-critical software that's going to meet needs in that kind of an environment. And now hardware flows are also emerging that enable that kind of process to be applied to the hardware implementation, and we will see as we run on through these series how these capabilities can be applied. So the goal here is to be able to evolve a model-driven development model from its requirements right the way through to an implementable system. People often ask, well, how am I going to do this? This is a big change. This is not the way we work today. And in order to adopt model-driven development, you need to think about the system engineering aspects, considering the full flow, the whole system, rather than staying trapped in one discipline. But to execute upon that and implement it, it's necessary to start small. Pick something within scope that can be handled. And the best way to do that is to identify a top-level question that, if you could have answered that question earlier in the flow, would have helped on the previous project, would have saved a previous design that never got to market. What trade-off could have been made had a question been able to be asked earlier in the design process? Effective things to do are to look for cycle time improvements. Why? Because it's a very tangible, visible benefit from the process. If there's something that model-driven development can do to shorten the cycle time, management recognizes that as valuable. But also, in the course of a design process, model-driven development, particularly the ability to transfer from one stage of model into the next, means that data continuity eliminates manual data re-entry, and that saves hugely on the introduction of errors in the typical design process. Any iterations that can be made early in the design process will save greatly on having to have made those same iterations on a physical prototype or an implemented system. So I've talked a bit about the context, and now I want to talk a little bit about executable, translatable UML and where we're going with its capabilities in xtUML.org. xtUML has been implemented in the Bridgepoint tool series. And Bridgepoint comprises three fundamental areas. The UML editors are the environment in which a developer creates models, performs the modeling activities, puts together all the attributes of the system, specifies those interfaces, and creates graphically and textually the structure and behavior of the model. Those UML editors are going to be taken to the open source environment, enabling users to work with those editors and extend them and expand them, enabling them to be accessible and understandable to anybody who would like to know more about how UML works and how it operates. The other building blocks of Bridgepoint, the verifier, the part that provides for the execution of those UML models as they're being developed, and the model compilers or translators that enable translation of a UML model into, for example, the C language for software, or System C for hardware virtual platform execution, will continue to be developed by Mentor Graphics. They're complex and in need of continuing development and support in order to provide the capabilities needed in those areas. And we will continue to develop those within the Mentor Graphics development teams. But if you're interested in understanding more about UML and how it works, then we have just launched the xtUML.org website. This portal provides access for the system design community to get to the UML editors, to understand what's there and how they operate, and to participate in the community. So by looking at the website, you will be able to go and see how you can participate, get access to the software, understand its capabilities, and then contribute to the community and the development of xtUML as it moves on into the future. I encourage you to go and log on to xtUML.org, and I also encourage you to come back to the next episode of our series, where we will look at UML, xtUML, and the xtUML flow in more detail. Thank you.